Chapter 12. They sat on the benches naked and cold for a long time while the barber worked on each in turn. Hannah glanced around cautiously. With their hair gone, they all looked like little old men. She wondered what she looked like herself, resisting the urge to put her hand up to her head again. She would not think about it. Thinking was dangerous. In this place, she would not think, only do. After a while, time seemed to lose its reality. Only the snick-snack of the scissors and the occasional cry of the barber's victims marked the minutes. There was a dreamlike feeling in the room as if Hannah thought anything might happen next. The woman in the blue dress entered the far door and stood for a long moment examining them all with a sour face. Hannah happened to be facing the door when she entered and, without meaning to, locked eyes with her. It was the woman who looked away first, calling out, "Schnell! Into the next room! You must have clothes!" She turned abruptly, signaling with her hand. For the first time, Hannah noticed that she had only 3 fingers on her right hand. I wonder how she lost those fingers, Hannah thought. Was she born that way? Then remembered she was not going to think. She rose with the others and shuffled out of the room after them. For the first time, Hannah allowed herself to feel hungry, but when she began to wonder about when they might be fed, the still, small voice reminded her, "Don't think. Do." She reached out and found the hand of one of the children. Silently, she squeezed the child's hand for comfort. The room they were herded into was a small, low-ceilinged place with a single window high up under the eaves. It reminded Hannah of an attic somewhere. She couldn't remember where. An unadorned light bulb dangled down over several long wooden tables piled high with rags. "Schmutz!" whispered a woman behind Hannah in a hoarse voice. "Jews!" bellowed the 3-fingered woman in blue. "Schnell!" Hannah took her turn at one of the tables and started to paw through the clothes. They were ragged and worn and smelled peculiar, with a lingering dank odor, part old sweat and part something else Hannah did not even want to guess at. She hesitated. "Jews, Jews! You cannot be fancy now." "Don't think. Do." Hannah put her hand onto the pile and came up with a dark gray dress with a dirty white collar and cuffs. There was a ragged rip along the hem and deep perspiration stains under the arms. Looking around, she saw that the other women were already slipping into whatever they had chosen. She raised the gray dress over her head and pulled it down. The material was silky and a bit stiff where it was stained. Buttoning the 3 buttons in front, she remembered suddenly how she had thought the dark blue dress Gito had given her ugly, how she'd called it a rag. Even that small return of memory was a comfort. She'd called the dress a rag. She hadn't known anything about wearing rags then. Her arms strained the sleeves of the gray dress. "Help the children," someone near her whispered. It sounded like Gito. Hannah glanced down at the naked child by her side. Was it Sephora? The poor little thing had her thumb in her mouth. Her eyelids were a bruised bluish color and she swayed where she stood. Hannah rummaged quickly through the pile of clothes and found a blouse and jumper that looked as if they might fit. The child made no move to help, and Hannah had to dress her as if she were a doll, pushing her arms into the sleeves of the blouse as gently as she could. They were herded directly into another room and made to line up single file. Another shaven-headed prisoner, with an odd-looking metal instrument, sat at a wooden table. There were guards at the door. Hannah could hear a mumble of voices by the table, but she couldn't begin to guess what they were discussing. Holding Sephora's hand, she moved in a slow, shuffling, barefooted rhythm of the line. Wait, walk, wait, walk. Closer to the table, she saw that the man was using the instrument to write something on each woman's arm. Strangely, no one protested or drew their arm away. Another memory, hazier than the one about the dress, flooded back to her. "This," she heard a familiar man's voice crying out. "I'll give them this." She couldn't think who it was or what he was giving to whom. When she turned to see who was speaking, everyone behind her was silent, staring at the floor. "Next." The man meant Hannah. She walked up to the table and sat down on a chair by the side of the table. "Tell me your name," the man said. "I will give you a number in exchange." That seemed simple enough, but she couldn't think of a name. There was none that came to her. From behind, Gito whispered hoarsely, "Kaya. Kaya Abramowitz." She said it aloud. Kaya. It felt, and it did not feel, like hers. The man looked at her, and his eyes were the saddest she'd ever seen, a muddy brown, like river sludge. His mouth was puckered and old. It dropped open as easily as a slot in a machine, and a sound, not quite a cry, came out. "I knew it would come," he whispered. "Someday, the Malakamavi." "What? What?" Hannah asked. "That is my daughter's dress you are wearing, Kaya Abramowicz. My Kaya. I brought it as a present for her in Lublin." "Kaya," Hannah said. "The same name, too. God is good. Your name means life." His voice broke. "Life," Hannah repeated. He nodded, then shook his head, the one following the other like a single movement. "You are Kaya no longer, child. Now you are J197241. Remember it." "I can't remember anything," Hannah said, puzzled. "This you must remember, for if you forget it, life is gone indeed." The tattooing pen burned her flesh, leaving a trail of blue numbers in her arm above the wrist. J197241. She didn't cry. She wouldn't. It was something more she just remembered, her promise to Gito. When the man finished the number, he reached out and touched the collar of her dress, smoothing it down gently. "Live," he whispered, "for my Kaya, for all our Kayas. Live and remember." There was a loud clearing of a throat, and Hannah looked up into the guard's unsmiling face. "Next," he said. Little Zipporah was next, and Hannah held the child on her lap, covering her eyes with ice-cold hands and crooning a song into her ears. It was a wedding song, the only song she could come up with, something about a madness forced upon them. The words didn't matter, only the melody, only the soothing rhythm. The child, Zipporah, J197242, lay silent in her arms. The barracks they were assigned had a long brick oven along one end and deep trenches on the sides in which sleeping shelves were placed, like triple bunk beds, at impossibly narrow intervals. Privies were outside. Hannah helped Zipporah onto one of the low shelves. There were neither blankets nor pillows, but the child did not complain. She curled into a fetal position and lay still, her thumb back in her mouth. "I will see if there is any food," Hannah whispered to her, "and socks and shoes. I will see if there are blankets or pillows. You sleep." When she stood up, she saw Gito helping Faye onto another shelf. About halfway down the building, she knew it was Faye because, even with her hair shorn, her face the color of an old book, and wearing a shapeless brown print dress, Faye had an unearthly beauty, but her eyes were strangely blank. She moved where Gito pushed her. Gito looked up and stared at Hannah, putting her hands on her hips, barely covering the garish flowers on the red print dress. She smiled mockingly. "So? So?" Hannah whispered back. In that dark, cold place, it seemed a kind of affirmation. At that very moment, her stomach rumbled, horribly loud in the silence of the barracks room. That, too, had the sound of life. Gito's head went back and she roared with laughter. "How can you laugh?" Hannah asked, shocked. "How can you not?" Gito said. "Without laughter, there is no hope. Without hope, there is no life. Without life, Hannah's voice trailed off, remembering the old tattooer. "Without food, there is no life," Gito said. "We will go and see if any of these monsters believes in food." The moment they tried to set a foot outside, a guard blocked their way. With their Yiddish, they were just able to understand his German. "You will not leave," he said, his baby face stern. "We have children in here who have not eaten for days," Gito answered. "They will get used to it," the soldier said as if the words were wrote in his mouth. "They will get used to it." "Just like the farmer who trained his horse to eat less and less," said Gito. "And just when he had gotten it to the point of learning to eat nothing at all, the ingrate up and died. I suppose you have heard that story." "I hear nothing important from Jews," the soldier said, "but I have something important to tell them. See that?" He pointed to a brick chimney towering over a flat-roofed building where a thin line of smoke curled lazily into the air. "That's Jew smoke. Learn to eat when it's given to you, Jew, or you too go up in that stack." "Jew smoke?" Gito whispered, but the soldier was already closing the door against her protesting hands. Hannah bit her lip. The smokestack and the ominous black curl emerging from it, dissipating against the bright blue sky, reminded her of something. Yet she couldn't quite touch it. It slipped away from her. Something about smoke, about fire, About ovens. Oven, she whispered. Well, Gittel said, at least we know something. Hannah looked up at her, the slip of memory gone. What? That we will be fed. When? God only knows, and let us hope that he tells the Germans. They turned back to stare around them, straining into the darkness of the barracks. Hannah saw that almost all the sleeping shelves were filled. The women and children lay as still as corpses. Look, not even the thought of food tempts them, Gittel said. Hannah could not keep herself from rubbing her eyes. The thought of sleep, horizontal sleep, suddenly overwhelmed her. What am I thinking of? Gittel said, the heel of her palm striking her forehead. You are only a child. You need sleep as well as food. She put her hand out to touch Hannah on the head and then, as if thinking better of it, patted her instead on the shoulder. Go to sleep, Kaya. Go to sleep. Hannah glanced down at her wrist. Go to sleep, J197241, you mean? You are a name, not a number. Never forget that name, whatever they tell you here. You will always be Kaya, life to me. You are my brother's child. You are my blood. Hannah shook her head slowly, but neither she nor Gittel knew what she really meant by it. She rubbed her fingers across the numbers on her sore arm as if memorizing them. Then she let Gittel lead her to an unoccupied shelf where she rolled herself onto it and, without even minding the rough surface, fell asleep. She dreamt of roast beef, sweet wine, and bitter herb.